Second Thoughts on James Burnham by George Orwell. James Burnham's book, The Managerial Revolution, made a considerable stir both in the United States and in England at the time when it was published, and its main thesis has been so much discussed that a detailed exposition of it is hardly necessary. As shortly as I can summarize it, the thesis is this. Capitalism is disappearing, but socialism is not replacing it. What is now arising is a new kind of planned, centralized society which will be neither capitalist nor, in any accepted sense of the word, democratic. The rulers of this new society will be the people who effectively control the means of production. That is, business executives, technicians, bureaucrats, and soldiers, lumped together by Burnham under the name of managers, quote-unquote. These people will eliminate the old capitalistic class, crush the working class, and so organize society that all power and economic privilege remain in their own hands. Private property rights will be abolished, but common ownership will not be established. The new quote-unquote managerial societies will not consist of a patchwork of small, independent states, but of great superstates grouped around the main industrial centers in Europe, Asia, and America. These superstates will fight amongst themselves for possession of the remaining uncaptured portions of the earth, but will probably be unable to conquer one another completely. Internally, each society will be hierarchical, with an aristocracy of talent at the top and a mass of semi-slaves at the bottom. In his next published book, The Machiavellians, Burnham elaborates and also modifies his original statement. The greater part of the book is an exposition of the theories of Machiavelli and of his modern disciples, Mosca, Michel, and Pareto. With doubtful justification, Burnham adds to these the syndicalist writer George Sorel. What Burnham is mainly concerned to show is that a democratic society has never existed and, so far as we can see, never will exist. Society is of its nature oligarchical, and the power of the oligarchy always rests upon force and fraud. Burnham does not deny that quote-unquote good motives may operate in private life, but he maintains that politics consists of the struggle for power and nothing else. All historical changes finally boil down to the replacement of one ruling class by another. All talk about democracy, liberty, equality, fraternity, all revolutionary movements, all visions of utopia, or the quote-unquote classless society, or the quote-unquote kingdom of heaven on earth, are humbug. Not necessarily conscious humbug, but humbug nonetheless, covering the ambitions of some new class which is elbowing its way into power. The English Puritans, the Jacobins, the Bolsheviks were in each case simply power seekers, using the hopes of the masses in order to win a privileged position for themselves. Power can sometimes be won or maintained without violence, but never without fraud. Because it is necessary to make use of the masses, and the masses would not cooperate if they knew that they were simply serving the purposes of a minority. In each great revolutionary struggle, the masses are led on by vague dreams of human brotherhood, and then, when the new ruling class is well established in power, they are thrust back into servitude. This is practically the whole of political history, as Burnham sees it. Where the second book departs from the earlier one is in asserting that the whole process could be somewhat moralized if the facts were faced more honestly. The Machiavellians is subtitled Defenders of Freedom. Machiavelli and his followers taught that in politics decency simply does not exist, and, by doing so, Burnham claims, made it possible to conduct political affairs more intelligently and less oppressively. A ruling class which recognized that its real aim was to stay in power would also recognize that it would be more likely to succeed if it served the common good, and might avoid stiffening into a hereditary aristocracy. Burnham lays much stress on Pareto's theory of, quote, circulation of the elites, unquote. If it is to stay in power, a ruling class must constantly admit suitable recruits from below, so that the ablest men may always be at the top, and a new class of power-hungry malcontents cannot come into being. This is likeliest to happen, Burnham considers, in a society which retains democratic habits. That is, where opposition is permitted, and certain bodies such as the press and the trade unions can keep their autonomy. Here, Burnham undoubtedly contradicts his earlier opinion. In The Managerial Revolution, which was written in 1940, it is taken as a matter of course that quote-unquote managerial Germany is in all ways more efficient than a capitalist democracy such as France or Britain. In the second book, written in 1942, Burnham admits that the Germans might have avoided some of their more serious strategic errors if they had permitted freedom of speech. However, the main thesis is not abandoned. Capitalism is doomed, and socialism is a dream. If we grasp what is at issue, we may guide the course of the managerial revolution to some extent, but that revolution is happening, whether we like it or not. In both books, but especially the earlier one, there is a note of unmistakable relish over the cruelty and wickedness of the processes that are being discussed. Although he reiterates that he is merely setting forth the facts and not stating his own preferences, it is clear that Burnham is fascinated by the spectacle of power, and that his sympathies were with Germany so long as Germany appeared to be winning the war. A more recent essay, Lenin's Heir, published in the Partisan Review around about the beginning of 1945, suggests that his sympathy has since been transferred to the USSR. Lenin's Heir provoked violent controversy in the American left-wing press. I must return to it later. It will be seen that Burnham's theory is not, strictly speaking, a new one. Many earlier writers have foreseen the emergence of a new kind of society, neither capitalist nor socialist, and probably based upon slavery. Though most of them have differed from Burnham in not assuming this development to be inevitable. A good example is Hilaire Belloc's book, The Servile State, published in 1911. The Servile State is written in a tiresome style, and the remedy it suggests, a return to small-scale peasant ownership, is for many reasons impossible. Still, it does foretell with remarkable insight the kind of things that have been happening from about 1930 onwards. Chesterton, in a less methodical way, predicted the disappearance of democracy and private property, and the rise of a slave society which might be called either capitalist or communist. Jack London, in 1909's Iron Heel, foretold some of the essential features of fascism, and such books as Wells's The Sleeper Awakes, from 1900, and Zamyatin's We, 1923, and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, from 1930, all described imaginary worlds in which the special problems of capitalism have been solved without bringing liberty, equality, or true happiness any nearer. More recently, writers like Peter Drucker and F.A. Voigt have argued that fascism and communism are substantially the same thing. And indeed, it has always been obvious that a planned and centralized society is liable to develop into an oligarchy or a dictatorship. Orthodox conservatives were unable to see this because it comforted them to assume that socialism, quote, wouldn't work, unquote, and that the disappearance of capitalism would mean chaos and anarchy. Orthodox socialists could not see it because they wished to think that they themselves would soon be in power, and therefore assume that when capitalism disappears, socialism takes its place. As a result, they were unable to foresee the rise of fascism or to make correct predictions about it after it happened. Later, the need to justify the Russian dictatorship and to explain away the obvious resemblances between communism and Nazism clouded the issue still more. But the notion that industrialism must end in monopoly, and the monopoly must imply tyranny, is not a startling one. Where Burnham differs from most other thinkers is in trying to plot the course of the quote-unquote managerial revolution accurately on a world scale, and in assuming that the drift towards totalitarianism is irresistible and must not be fought against, though it may be guided. According to Burnham, writing in 1940, quote-unquote managerialism has reached its fullest development in the USSR, but is almost equally well developed in Germany, and has made its appearance in the United States. He describes the New Deal as quote-unquote primitive managerialism. But the trend is the same everywhere, or almost everywhere. Always laissez-faire capitalism gives way to planning and state interference. The mere owner loses power against the technician and the bureaucrat, but socialism, that is to say, what used to be called socialism, shows no sign of emerging. Quote, some apologists try to excuse Marxism by saying that it has, quote-unquote, never had a chance. This is far from the truth. Marxism and the Marxist parties have had dozens of chances. In Russia, a Marxist party took power. Within a short time, it abandoned socialism, if not in words, at any rate in the effect of its actions. In most European nations, there were, during the last months of the First World War and the years immediately after, social crises which left a wide open door for the Marxist parties. Without exception, they proved unable to take and hold power. In a large number of countries, Germany, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Austria, England, Australia, New Zealand, Spain, France, the reformist Marxist parties have administered the governments and have uniformly failed to introduce socialism or make any genuine step towards socialism. These parties have, in practice, at every historical test, and there have been many, either failed socialism or abandoned it. This is the fact which neither the bitterest foe nor the most ardent friend of socialism can erase. This fact does not, as some think, prove anything about the moral quality of the socialist ideal, but it does constitute unblinkable evidence that, whatever its moral quality, socialism is not going to